She'd spent 20 years searching every back road and bus station for her missing son. When all hope was gone, she boarded a cruise ship ready to end her life. But right there on that ship, she saw him and couldn't believe her eyes. Her son was there too.
Oh my God.
If this story shocked you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband didn't make it. The officer said, his voice steady, but heavy like the air before a storm breaks. Edith's knees buckled the linoleum floor of her small kitchen, rushing up to meet her as she crumpled, a choked sob escaping her lips. The world spun, blurred by tears, and all she could hear was the echo of those words, didn't make it, cutting through her like a blade. The officer, a young man with tired eyes and a badge that read, Jenkins, reached out to steady her, but Edith waved him off, clutching the edge of the counter to pull herself upright. Her hands trembled, her knuckles white against the chipped formica. No, that can't be right, she whispered, her voice barely holding together. Walter was just heading to the hardware store. He was coming right back. The officer's face softened, but he didn't argue. Just stood there, his hat in his hands, letting the weight of the truth settle over her like dust. It was 1955, and the small town of Millwood, Georgia felt smaller than ever, its cotton fields stretching endlessly beyond the clapboard houses, the air thick with the hum of cicadas and the scent of sun-baked earth. Edith Thompson, barely 30, stood in her kitchen, the heart of a home she'd built with Walter, now shattered by a single moment. The officer explained a car accident, a slick road, a truck that came out of nowhere, but the words didn't stick. They slipped through her mind like sand, leaving only the raw ache of loss. Edith's life hadn't always been this fragile. Born in 1925, in a ramshackle house on the edge of Millwood, she'd grown up knowing hardship like an old friend. Her father, a mechanic with calloused hands and a quiet smile, had gone off to fight in World War II when she was just 16. He never came back, his name etched on a memorial stone in the town square, leaving her mother, Clara, to raise Edith and her two younger siblings alone. Clara was a frail woman, worn thin by grief and poverty, and when Lily, Edith's youngest sister, fell ill with a fever that wouldn't break the weight of the family, fell on Edith's shoulders. At 17, Edith quit school, trading textbooks for long hours at the local diner, washing dishes until her hands cracked and bled. Lily, with her pale skin and fragile cough, needed medicine they couldn't afford, and their mother's health faded with each passing winter. By the time Edith was 20, both Clara and Lily were gone, buried side by side in the churchyard, their graves marked by simple stones Edith had saved for months to buy. She'd stood there alone, the wind tugging at her coat, promising herself she'd find a way to keep going, even if the world felt hollow. That promise carried her through the next few years, through endless shifts at the diner and odd jobs, sewing, cleaning, whatever paid. She was 25 when she met Walter Thompson, a man who seemed to carry the sun in his smile. He'd come into the diner one humid afternoon, his work boots caked with red Georgia clay, his eyes kind but steady, like he'd seen enough of the world to know its sharp edges but chose to look past them. Walter was a carpenter, strong and deliberate, with hands that could shape wood into something beautiful, and a heart that made Edith feel safe for the first time in years. Their courtship wasn't grand, there were no sweeping gestures or fancy dates, but it was real. Walter would sit at the diner counter sipping coffee that had gone cold just to talk to her during her breaks. He'd tell her stories of his childhood, of fishing in the creek with his brothers, of the time he'd built a tree house for his sister and nearly broke his arm falling out of it. Edith found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time since Lily's death. Walter saw her not just the tired waitress with frayed aprons, but the woman who'd carried her family through grief and never let herself break. "I ain't much for words, Edith," he'd said one evening as they sat on the porch of her rented room, the stars blinking above them. "But I reckon I love you more than I ever thought I could love anybody." His voice was low, earnest, and when he took her hand, his calluses rough against her skin, she felt something shift inside her, a spark of hope she'd thought was long gone. They married 6 months later in a simple ceremony at the town hall with a handful of friends and a bouquet of wildflowers Edith had picked herself. Their son Ken came a year later, a squalling bundle with Walter's dark eyes and Edith's stubborn chin. The three of them built a life in a small house on the edge of town with a garden where Walter grew tomatoes and a porch where Edith rocked Ken to sleep on warm evenings. Walter was a devoted father, singing off-key lullabies and carving tiny wooden horses for Ken to play with. He'd hoist the boy onto his shoulders, pointing out constellations, or showing him how to sand a plank until it was smooth as glass. "This here's our family, Edith," he'd say, pulling her close as Ken giggled between them. "Ain't nothing gonna break us." But something did. That morning in 1955, Walter had kissed her goodbye, promising to be back before supper with a new latch for the screen door. The call from the police came hours later, and now, as Edith stood in her kitchen, the officer's words still ringing in her ears, she felt the world she'd built collapsing. The funeral was a blur, neighbors' hushed voices, the scent of lilies, the weight of Ken's small hand in hers. She barely remembered the service, only the sight of Walter's coffin-polished oak gleaming under the church's dim lights, and the way her chest ached like it might never stop. At the graveside, as the preacher's voice droned on, a man approached her, his suit crisp despite the heat. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Richard Grayson," he said, his voice smooth, almost too polished for Millwood. "I worked with Walter on a few projects. I'm so sorry for your loss." His eyes were steady, his handshake firm, and Edith, still numb, nodded gratefully. She'd heard Walter mention Richard, a business partner who'd helped him land bigger carpentry jobs, but she'd never met him. He seemed kind, his words careful, and in her grief she didn't notice the cold edge in his gaze the way it lingered a little too long. The weeks that followed were a fog of pain. Edith moved through her days like a ghost, tending to Ken, who was too young to understand why his father wasn't coming home. The house felt too big, too quiet, without Walter's laughter to fill it. She'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the officer's words about the accident. A curve in the road, a truck that didn't stop. Something about it gnawed at her, a whisper of doubt she couldn't shake, but she pushed it down. Accidents happened. Walter was gone, and she had to keep going for Ken. Richard started coming around always with a reason, a tool. Walter had lent him a condolence card, an offer to help with the bills. Walter was a good man, he'd say, sitting at her kitchen table, his hands folded neatly. "I want to make sure you and Ken are taken care of." His promises were a lifeline in her despair, a better school for Ken, a chance at a future Walter would have wanted. Edith, worn down by grief and the weight of raising a boy alone, clung to his words like a drowning woman to a raft. She didn't see the calculation in his smile, the way he watched her like a man sizing up a prize. By the spring, Richard's visits had become routine. He'd bring toys for Ken, small things like a tin car or a wooden puzzle, and tell Edith about his plans to move north where opportunities were better. "I can take Ken with me," he said one evening, his voice gentle but firm. "Give him a chance at a good education, a real shot at life. You'd still see him, Edith. I'd make sure of it." She hesitated, her heart twisting at the thought of letting her son go, but Richard's assurances were so steady, so certain, that she began to believe him. When he offered to take Ken for a trial summer in Atlanta, promising to enroll him in a private school, Edith agreed. She packed Ken's small suitcase, tucking in his favorite wooden horse, and kissed him goodbye at the bus station, her tears falling as he waved through the window. Richard stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice soothing. "You're doing the right thing," he said. "This is for Ken's future." Months passed, and then, without warning, Richard was gone. No letters, no calls, no trace. The address he'd given her led to an empty lot in Atlanta, the phone number disconnected. It was 1956, and the summer heat pressed down on her like a weight, but it was the silence from Richard Grayson. His phone disconnected his address, a lie that crushed her most. She'd trusted him, handed over her son for a better life, and now both were gone, swallowed by a world that didn't care. Edith's search began with a fevered desperation, her heart pounding with the certainty that Ken was just around the next corner, waiting for her to find him. She took buses across Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, her meager savings dwindling with every ticket. She knocked on doors in towns so small they barely had names showing strangers, a faded photograph of Ken, his gap-toothed smile, his dark eyes so like Walter's. "Have you seen my boy?" She'd ask, her voice raw, her hands trembling as she held out the picture. Most folks shook their heads, their pity sharp as a blade, while others turned away, unwilling to meet her haunted gaze. The years stretched on each one, carving deeper lines into Edith's face, turning her dark hair to silver. She wandered from one dusty town to another, chasing whispers of a man named Richard Grayson, a businessman, a drifter, a liar. In Birmingham, a diner waitress swore she'd seen a boy like Ken with a man matching Richard's description, but the trail went cold in a boarding house that had burned down months before. In Savannah, a pawnshop owner remembered a locket like the one Edith wore sold for a few dollars, but no one could say where the seller had gone. Every lead was a dead end, every hope a wound that refused to heal. By the time Edith was in her 40s, her body bore the marks of her endless journey. Her hands, once soft from Walter's gentle touch, were now calloused from scrubbing floors, picking fruit, and sewing seams for pennies. She lived in rented rooms, each one smaller and shabbier than the last, her only possessions a suitcase and a shoebox filled with Ken's old drawings and Walter's love letters. At night, she'd sit by a cracked window, staring at the black sky, whispering prayers she wasn't sure anyone heard. "Please, just let me see him again," she'd murmur, her voice breaking as she pictured Ken's face. Would he still have that crooked grin? Or had time stolen that too? The guilt was a constant companion, heavier than the suitcase she dragged behind her. She'd replay that day at the bus station, the moment she let Ken go, his small hand slipping from hers as he climbed aboard with Richard. "Why didn't I see it?" she'd whisper to herself, her fingers tracing the locket she wore a twin to the one she'd given Ken, both holding a tiny photo of Walter. She'd trusted Richard because he'd seemed kind, because Walter had spoken well of him, because she was drowning in grief and needed someone to throw her a line. Now she was adrift, her heart torn by the question that haunted her every waking moment. Does my boy even remember me? The years ground her down, but Edith kept moving, driven by a stubborn spark that refused to die. She took whatever work she could find, cleaning houses, washing dishes, mending clothes, her body aching, but her mind fixed on Ken. She'd lie awake in the dark, imagining him grown, wondering if he hated her for letting him go, if he even knew she was still out there searching. The thought of him calling someone else Mama was a knife in her chest, twisting deeper with every passing year. She'd failed him just as she'd failed Walter by not questioning the accident that took him, by not seeing the shadow behind Richard's smile. By 1975, Edith was 60, her hair white as cotton, her eyes dulled by decades of disappointment. She'd saved every penny she could, hiding crumpled bills in a tin can under her bed, until she had enough for one last act. She bought a ticket for a suite on a luxury cruise ship, the Star of the Atlantic, departing from Charleston. It wasn't for pleasure. She had no use for that anymore. The ocean called to her, vast and unyielding, a place where she could finally let go, where the pain and guilt could sink into the depths with her. She packed her locket, Ken's photo, and a single dress, planning to slip away under the stars, her life ending as quietly as it had unraveled. The ship was a world apart from the dusty roads she'd wandered. Its polished decks gleamed under the sun, and the air smelled of salt and wealth. Edith, in her worn coat and scuffed shoes, felt like a ghost among the passengers, men in tailored suits, women dripping with jewelry, their laughter sharp and careless. They glanced at her with disdain, their eyes skimming over her like she was part of the scenery, not a person. She kept to herself, sitting in a corner of the grand dining room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for the night when she'd climb the railing and let the sea take her. It was on the second day, as she sat on a deck chair, the wind tugging at her scarf that she saw him. A man in a captain's uniform, broad-shouldered and confident, stood at the helm addressing the crew. His face was older, lined by years, but his eyes, those dark, familiar eyes, stopped her heart. Around his neck, glinting in the sunlight, was a locket identical to hers, its silver worn, but unmistakable. Edith's breath caught her hands trembling as she gripped the arms of her chair. It was Ken. Her Ken grown into a man standing tall on this ship, unaware of the mother who'd spent half her life searching for him. Her heart pounded a mix of joy and terror as she watched him move with purpose, his voice carrying over the deck. She wanted to run to him, to throw her arms around him and sob his name, but her legs wouldn't move. She was a stranger to him now, a tired old woman in a threadbare coat, and the weight of that truth pinned her to her seat. Tears stung her eyes as she clutched her own locket, her fingers tracing the familiar shape, her mind racing with questions. How had he ended up here? Did he know what Richard had done? Did he even remember her? Edith's hands shook as she approached the ship's bridge, her steps slow and unsteady, like she was walking through a dream that might shatter. The locket hung heavy against her chest, its twin gleaming on the man she knew was her son. She'd asked a crew member his name, Captain Ken Marshall, and the words had hit her like a wave, confirming what her heart already screamed. Ken, her boy, was alive, standing just beyond a door she wasn't sure she had the courage to open. She'd waited until evening when the ship was quiet, the passengers tucked into their cabins or sipping cocktails in the lounge. The hallway to the bridge was dim, the hum of the ship's engines a steady pulse beneath her feet. She knocked her knuckles, barely grazing the door, and when it opened there, he was tall, weathered, his dark eyes narrowing as they met hers. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice polite but guarded, a captain assessing a stranger. Edith's throat tightened. Her words caught behind a flood of emotions. I think you're my son," she said, her voice breaking as she held up her locket, its silver catching the light. "This was your father's. I gave you one just like it years ago." Ken's hand went to his own locket, his fingers brushing it as his brow furrowed. For a moment, she saw a flicker of something, recognition maybe, but it vanished, replaced by a hard, skeptical stare. "I don't know you," he said. His tone clipped, though his eyes lingered on her locket. "I got this when I was a kid." The words cut deeper than Edith could have imagined, each one a fresh wound. She stepped closer, her eyes wet, her voice trembling. "Ken, it's me, your mama. I've been looking for you since you were a boy. Richard took you, lied to me, and I've spent every day since trying to find you." Ken's jaw tightened, his gaze drifting past her like he was searching for an escape. "Lady, I don't know what you're after, but Richard's been good to me. Raised me, gave me a life. You've got the wrong man." He turned to close the door, but Edith reached out her hand, grazing his arm. "Please, Ken," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Just listen. I'm your mother. I'd know you anywhere." He pulled away, his eyes cold, and the door clicked shut, leaving Edith alone in the hallway, her heart splintering. She sank against the wall, her sobs quiet but wrenching the locket clutched so tightly it dug into her palm. She'd found him after all these years, only to lose him again to the lies of a man she'd once trusted. Ken, shaken by the encounter, sought out Richard later that night in the ship's private lounge. Richard, now in his 60s, sat sipping whiskey, his suit impeccable, his smile as smooth as ever. "What's this about some woman claiming to be your mother?" Ken asked, his voice low, his fingers tightening around his locket. Richard's eyes flickered, but his expression stayed calm, almost pitying. "Son, I hate to say it, but there's folks out there who'll spin any tale to get close to a man like you. She's probably after money or worse, just stirring up trouble." Ken frowned, his mind churning. "She had a locket, Richard. Just like mine. Said it was my father's." Richard leaned forward, his voice soft, persuasive. "Lots of lockets look alike, Ken. You were too young to remember, but your mother, she wasn't right in the head." left you with me because she couldn't cope. I raised you, gave you this life. Don't let some stranger make you doubt that. Meanwhile, Richard found Edith the next morning, catching her as she sat alone on the deck, staring at the endless sea. The morning sun cast a harsh glare across the deck of the Star of the Atlantic, its light doing little to warm the chill in Edith's bones. As she sat alone, her gaze lost in the endless churn of the sea. Her hands clutched the locket at her neck, its familiar weight a tether to a past that felt more like a fading dream. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying Ken's cold dismissal, his eyes, Walter's eyes, looking through her like she was a stranger. The pain of it gnawed at her, a fresh wound layered over decades of grief. Footsteps approached, deliberate and unhurried, and Edith looked up to see Richard Grayson standing over her, his tailored coat pristine despite the salt air. His face was a mask of concern, but his eyes held that same calculating glint she'd failed to notice all those years ago. Before he could speak, Edith's grief ignited into fury, her voice sharp and raw as she rose from her chair, her hands trembling with rage. "You stole my boy, Richard!" She spat, her words cutting through the morning quiet, drawing curious glances from a few passing passengers. "You took Ken, lied to me, and left me with nothing. How dare you stand here acting like you care when you ripped my family apart?" Her voice cracked, but her eyes burned, years of pent-up anguish pouring out like a dam breaking. Richard didn't flinch, his expression softening into something almost paternal, his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Edith, please," he said, his voice low and steady, like a man soothing a wounded animal. "I know you're hurting and I don't blame you for hating me, but you've got to understand, everything I did was for Ken's sake. He was just a boy lost in a world that wasn't kind to kids like him. I gave him a home, a future, a chance to be someone." Edith's fists clenched, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to scream. "You had no right," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and despair. "He was my son, mine and Walter's. You tricked me, made me think you were helping us, and then you vanished with him. Do you know what that did to me? Do you know how many years I've spent searching, wondering if he was even alive?" Richard's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding, but his tone remained gentle, almost mournful. "I know it's hard to hear, Edith, but Ken needed to leave that life behind, the poverty, the grief, the weight of a mother who was drowning in her own pain. You were barely holding on after Walter died. I saw it, and so did he, even as young as he was. I took him to protect him, to give him a clean slate. He's a captain now, respected, successful. If you drag him back to that old pain, you'll tear down everything he's built. You'll break him. Edith, and I know you don't want that." His words landed like a blow, each one sinking into the cracks of her resolve. She wanted to lash out, to call him a liar, but the truth in his voice, or what felt like truth, twisted her anger into doubt. Had she been too broken back then, too lost in her grief to be the mother Ken needed? Had Richard really saved him from her? Her shoulders sagged, the fire in her eyes dimming as she sank back into the deck chair. Her voice reduced to a whisper. "I just want my son back," she said, the words heavy with a longing she'd carried for decades. Richard stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the railing beside her, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "I understand, Edith. I do. But Ken's not that little boy anymore. He's got a life, a career, people who depend on him. If you push too hard, if you try to pull him back into a past, he doesn't even remember. You'll hurt him more than you can imagine. Let him be happy, Edith. Let him have the life I gave him. You loved him enough to let him go once. Can't you do it again for his sake?" Edith's throat tightened, her eyes stinging as she stared out at the sea, its waves rolling endlessly, indifferent to her pain. Richard's words wormed their way into her mind, stirring the guilt she'd carried since the day she'd let Ken board that bus. Maybe he was right. Maybe Ken was better off without her, without the weight of her failures dragging him down. Her fingers traced the locket, the photo of Walter inside a reminder of the family she'd lost, and she felt the fight drain out of her. She didn't answer, couldn't find the words. And Richard took her silence as agreement, giving her a slow nod before walking away, his footsteps fading into the hum of the ship. She sat there long after he was gone, the wind tugging at her scarf, her heart heavy with a familiar ache. The sea stretched out before her, vast and unyielding, and for the first time in years, Edith wondered if she'd been wrong to keep searching, to keep hoping. Would chasing Ken destroy the man he'd become, just as Richard said? The thought settled over her like a fog, and she felt herself slipping back into the despair she'd thought she'd left behind, her dreams of reunion fading into the gray horizon. The wind howled across the deck of the Star of the Atlantic, sharp and cold, as if the sea itself were raging against Edith's despair. She stood at the railing, her hands gripping the icy metal, the black waves below churning like her thoughts. It was well past midnight, the ship's lights dimmed, and the stars were hidden behind a blanket of clouds. She'd come here to say goodbye, not just to Ken, not just to Walter, but to herself. The weight of 20 years searching, of trusting Richard Grayson, of losing everything, had worn her down to a shadow. The sea was her escape, a final release from a life that had taken more than it gave. She reached for the locket at her neck, its silver worn smooth by years of touch, and opened it with trembling fingers. Walter's face stared back at her, young and smiling, frozen in a moment when the world still made sense. Her thumb brushed the photo, a ritual of farewell. But as she did, something shifted. A faint crinkle, a hidden edge. She frowned, her heart stuttering, and carefully peeled back the photo. Tucked behind it was a slip of paper, yellowed and brittle, folded so small she'd never noticed it in all these years. Her breath caught as she unfolded it, the wind nearly snatching it away. In Walter's familiar scrawl, the words hit her like a thunderclap. "If I die." Richard did it. Edith froze the paper, trembling in her hands as the words sank in. Walter hadn't just died in some random accident. Richard had taken him from her just as he'd taken Ken. The grief that had dulled her senses for years ignited into something fierce, a burning anger that pulsed through her veins. Her vision blurred with tears, but they weren't tears of sorrow anymore. They were rage, raw and unyielding, mixed with a spark of hope she hadn't felt in decades. Walter's death wasn't an accident, and Ken wasn't lost to her by chance. Richard had orchestrated it all, and she'd be damned if she let him win. "I won't let you get away with this," she whispered to the wind, her voice steady despite the storm in her heart. "Not Walter's death, and not my son." The next morning, Edith was still shaken, the note tucked safely in her pocket, her mind racing with what it meant. She wandered the ship's crowded dining hall, her worn coat and scuffed shoes, drawing sneers from the wealthier passengers. She barely noticed her thoughts fixed on Richard's lies until a commotion broke her reverie. A young waitress no older than 25 with auburn hair and a nervous smile had spilled a glass of wine on a man in a tailored suit. He stood, his face red with anger, his voice booming across the room. "You clumsy girl! Do you know how much this suit costs? You're lucky I don't have you fired." The girl her name tag read. Emma flinched, her hands fumbling with a napkin as she stammered an apology. The other passengers watched, some smirking, others turning away, but Edith couldn't stay silent. She stepped forward, her voice firm despite the quiver in her chest. "Now hold on a minute, sir. It was an accident and she's doing her best. Ain't no call to treat her like that over a spilled drink." The man turned, his scowl faltering under Edith's steady gaze, her years of hardship lending her words a quiet strength. He muttered something and sat back down, the tension easing as Emma shot Edith a look of gratitude, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Later, as Emma cleared tables nearby, she approached Edith, her voice soft. "Thank you, ma'am. You didn't have to do that." Edith managed a small smile, her heart still heavy, but warmed by the girl's kindness. "Folks like him think they can walk over everybody. I've seen enough of that in my time." Emma lingered, her hands twisting the rag she held, and something in her expression open earnest made Edith trust her. Over coffee in a quiet corner of the ship, Edith found herself spilling the truth, the note in the locket, Richard's betrayal, and her desperate hope to reclaim her son. Emma listened, her eyes wide, and when Edith finished, she leaned forward, her voice fierce. "That man's no good, Mrs. Thompson. I'll help you whatever it takes." From that moment, a bond formed, fragile but real, like a lifeline thrown across a stormy sea. Emma became Edith's shadow, watching her with a care that felt almost daughterly. Her presence a reminder that Edith wasn't alone. For the first time in years, a flicker of light broke through the darkness in Edith's heart, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could uncover the truth and bring Ken back to her. The Star of the Atlantic cut through the night, its engines a low hum beneath the restless waves, but Edith felt the weight of the ship like a trap closing around her. She sat with Emma in a dimly lit crew break room, the air thick with the smell of coffee and engine oil. Emma's voice was hushed, her eyes darting to the door as she leaned close. "Richard's got a safe in the engineering deck." She said, her words careful but urgent. "I've seen him go down there late at night, always looking over his shoulder like he's hiding something. Papers, maybe, or worse. If there's proof of what he did to you and your husband, that's where it'll be." Edith's heart quickened, her fingers tightening around the note from Walter's locket now tucked in her coat pocket. "You're sure he keeps it there?" she asked, her voice low, her mind racing with the possibility of answers. Emma nodded, her auburn hair catching the faint light. "He thinks you've given up, Mrs. Thompson. He's cocky like that, figures nobody's brave enough to cross him." Her words were a spark igniting Edith's resolve, but fear lingered too, a cold knot in her stomach. Richard had taken everything from her once. What would he do if she got too close to his secrets? Emma had a plan, bold and risky, built on a debt of gratitude from an unlikely ally. "There's an old engineer, Mr. Callahan," she explained, her voice steady despite the danger. "Richard threatened to fire him last year over some mistake, but I spoke up for him, saved his job. A few months back, I pulled him out of the way when a crate nearly crushed him in the cargo hold. He owes me, and he don't trust Richard one bit." Edith listened, her eyes meeting Emma's, and for the first time in days, she felt a surge of faith, not in fate, but in this young woman who'd chosen to stand with her. She reached out, her calloused hand closing over Emma's, and squeezed gently. "I don't know why you're doing this for me, but I'm grateful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The plan came together in whispers, each step a gamble. Emma would get close to Richard, using her role as a waitress to slip into his cabin under the guise of serving tea. "He's always got that key on him," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Hangs it on a chain in his pocket. I'll find a way to lift it." Edith, meanwhile, scoured the ship's library, poring over crew manuals and technical diagrams, her fingers tracing faded maps of the engineering deck, until she found a reference to a safe's combination code, scribbled in a margin by some long-gone mechanic. The numbers 7 to 1429 burned into her memory, a fragile thread of hope. Her heart pounded a mix of terror and determination, as if she were waking from a long sleep, her life suddenly hers, to fight for again. The night of the break-in was stormy, the ship swaying as waves battered its hull, the lights flickering in the lower decks. Edith and Emma moved like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the roar of the sea. Mr. Callahan, a grizzled man with a limp and eyes that had seen too much, met them at the entrance to the engineering deck. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice rough but steady, his hand on the door's lock. Edith nodded, her jaw tight, the note in her pocket like a talisman. "I've got to know the truth," she said, her words carrying the weight of 20 years of loss. Callahan disabled the first security gate, his hands deft despite their tremble, and led them through a maze of pipes and machinery, the air hot and heavy with the smell of oil. The safe was hidden behind a panel, its steel door gleaming in the dim light of Emma's flashlight. Edith's hands shook as she entered the combination, the numbers clicking into place with agonizing slowness. The safe opened with a soft thud, and she held her breath, her heart pounding as she reached inside. Her fingers brushed a stack of papers, old and brittle, and she pulled them out, her eyes scanning the faded ink, searching for the truth that had eluded her for so long. The air in the engineering deck was thick with the smell of oil and steel, the hum of the Star of the Atlantic's engines vibrating through the floor like a heartbeat. Edith's hands trembled as she clutched a stack of brittle letters, their edges curling with age, each one bearing Walter's handwriting. The words she'd just read. "If I die." Richard did it burned in her mind, a truth she'd sensed but never dared to face. Her eyes stung with tears, not just from grief, but from a fury that had lain dormant for 20 years now, roaring to life. She gripped the letters so tightly her knuckles whitened, as if holding them could somehow bring Walter back, could undo the lie that had stolen her son. Emma stood beside her, her flashlight casting jagged shadows across the safe's open door. Her hand rested on Edith's shoulder, her voice a shaky whisper. "Mrs. Thompson, you okay?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern, her breath catching as she glanced at the papers. Edith couldn't answer, her throat too tight, her heart pounding with the weight of what she'd found. The letters were a lifeline, proof that Richard's betrayal ran deeper than she'd ever imagined, but they were also a wound ripping open the past she'd tried so hard to bury. Before she could speak, a shrill alarm pierced the silence, its wail echoing through the metal corridors. Red lights flashed overhead, painting the walls in pulses of crimson. Emma's face paled, her flashlight dropping to the floor with a clatter. "He knows," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the siren. "Richard's got some kind of alert on the safe." Edith's heart lurched, her hands fumbling to shove the letters into her coat pocket, the paper crinkling against her trembling fingers. They had to move, had to get out before Richard's men found them. But her legs felt heavy, as if the truth itself were anchoring her to the spot. Footsteps pounded in the distance, sharp and deliberate, accompanied by the crackle of radios. "Seal the deck!" A voice barked, cold and authoritative. Emma grabbed Edith's arm, her grip firm despite her fear. "Come on, we gotta go," she urged, pulling Edith toward the shadowed hallway. The older woman stumbled, her breath ragged, but Emma's strength kept her moving, their footsteps muffled by the roar of the ship's engines. The corridor was a maze of pipes and flickering lights, the air hot and suffocating. But Emma led the way, her eyes darting to every corner, her instincts sharp from years of navigating the ship's underbelly. They'd barely reached the first stairwell when a figure emerged from the shadows, his silhouette tall and imposing, his face lit by the cold glow of a flashlight. Richard Grayson stood before them, his eyes like shards of ice, his mouth set in a thin, dangerous line. "Edith," he said, his voice low and venomous, "you just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" His gaze flicked to the bulge in her coat pocket, and his expression darkened, a predator sensing prey. "You're gonna ruin that boy's life, digging up things that don't concern you no more." Edith's anger surged, drowning her fear, her voice shaking but fierce. "I won't let you keep lying to him," she said, her words sharp as she stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. "You took my husband, my son, my whole world. I know what you did, Richard, and I ain't letting you hide it no longer." Her eyes burned with tears, but she held his gaze, refusing to back down, the letters in her pocket like a shield against his lies. Richard's smile was cold, calculated as he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think Ken wants to hear your sob story? He's got a good life, a career, respect. You drag him into this mess, and you'll break him, Edith. You'll take everything he's worked for and turn it to dust." His words were a blade twisting into her doubts, but Edith shook her head, her voice cracking with defiance. "I can't let you keep him in the dark. He deserves the truth." Emma, quick as a flash, shoved the letters deeper into Edith's pocket and flicked off her flashlight, plunging the hallway into darkness. "Run!" she hissed, grabbing Edith's hand and pulling her toward the stairwell. The older woman's heart pounded, her legs unsteady, but moving, driven by a desperate need to reach Ken before Richard's lies could tighten their grip. The alarms screamed, footsteps thundered behind them, and the red lights pulsed like a warning of fate itself. They raced through the narrow corridors, aiming for the captain's quarters, hoping Ken would listen, that the truth in those letters would be enough to break through the years of deception. The captain's quarters were a quiet oasis amid the chaos of the Star of the Atlantic, its walls lined with polished wood, a single lamp casting a warm glow over the room. Ken stood in the center, his broad shoulders tense, his dark eyes flickering with confusion and pain as Edith and Emma burst through the door, breathless and disheveled. The alarms still wailed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the danger closing in, but Edith's focus was on her son, his face so like Walter's, it made her chest ache. She clutched the letters in her pocket, their weight a lifeline, a bridge to the past she'd lost. Richard was already there, his suit impeccable despite the late hour. His voice smooth as he spoke to Ken, his words dripping with false sincerity. "She's confused, son," he said, gesturing toward Edith, his tone gentle but laced with venom. "She's been chasing ghosts for years, trying to drag you into her pain. Don't let her ruin what you've built." His eyes flicked to Edith, a warning glinting in their depths, but she stepped forward, her hands trembling as she pulled the letters from her pocket and held them out to Ken. "Look at these," she said, her voice breaking. Her eyes wet with tears as she pointed to the locket around his neck, its twin hanging at her own. "Your daddy wrote these, Ken. He knew Richard was trouble, knew he'd come for him. That accident wasn't no accident, and Richard's been lying to you your whole life." Her words spilled out, raw and desperate, each one a plea for her son to see the truth. Ken's gaze darted between them, his jaw tight, his hands clenching at his sides. The locket gleamed against his uniform, a relic of a childhood he barely remembered, and for a moment his eyes softened, memories stirring like ripples on a still pond. He saw flashes of a warm kitchen, his mother's arms around him, his father's laughter as they played in the yard. The images were faint, buried under years of Richard's stories, but they were real, and they tore at him, pulling him apart. "You're lying." Richard snapped, his voice sharp now, his composure cracking. "She's a desperate old woman, Ken trying to scam you to ruin everything I gave you." But Ken's eyes were on the letters, his hands shaking as he took them from Edith, his fingers tracing Walter's handwriting. The words were like a key unlocking a door he'd forgotten existed, and tears welled in his eyes as the truth broke through. "You killed my daddy," he said, his voice low, trembling with rage as he turned to Richard. "You took my whole life from me." Richard lunged forward, his face twisted with fury, but the door burst open and security officers flooded the room, their radios crackling as they grabbed him, pinning his arms. "You don't understand," Richard shouted, struggling against their grip. But Ken stepped back, his hand finding Edith's, his fingers tightening around hers. The alarm still echoed a pulse of fate that matched the pounding in his chest, but his eyes were clear, resolute. Hours later, as dawn broke over the sea, Ken stood before the passengers and crew, his voice steady despite the weight of what he'd learned. "Richard Grayson betrayed my family," he said, his words carrying across the deck, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "He took my father's life and stole me from my mother. But the truth's out now." The passengers stared, some shocked, others whispering, their eyes settling on Edith, who stood at Ken's side, her worn coat and silver hair a stark contrast to the ship's opulence. The sea sparkled behind them, its light washing away the shadows of lies that had lingered for decades. The sun rose over the Star of the Atlantic, its golden light spilling across the deck, warming the air as Edith stood beside Ken, his arm around her shoulders. They were on the ship's bow, the sea stretching endlessly before them, and for the first time in years, Edith felt a quiet settle over her heart. Ken's embrace was tight, his tears mingling with hers as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Mama. I should have known you were out there looking for me." His voice was thick with regret. His eyes, Walter's eyes shining with a love she'd feared was lost forever. Edith reached up her hand, trembling as she touched his face, her voice soft but steady. You're still my boy. Ken. Always will be." The words were a balm healing wounds that had festered for decades. And as they stood there, the sea breeze carrying the scent of salt and freedom, she felt the weight of her grief begin to lift, replaced by a fragile but growing peace. Months later, in a Charleston courtroom, Edith sat tall, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Richard Grayson as the judge read his sentence. Murder, kidnapping, fraud, the charges piled up, each one a nail in the coffin of his lies. Richard's face was pale, his charm gone, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. Ken sat beside Edith, his hand on hers, his presence a steady anchor as she faced the man who'd stolen her life. When the gavel fell, sentencing Richard to life behind bars, Edith exhaled the air, leaving her like a burden she'd carried too long. Justice had come late, but unyielding, restoring the honor of her family. After the trial, Edith chose to stay in Charleston near the docks where Ken's ship came and went. They spent evenings together sorting through old photos and mementos, piecing together the years they'd lost. Ken showed her the wooden horse Walter had carved, kept all these years, and Edith's fingers traced its edges, tears falling as she remembered her husband's hands shaping it. The sea was their backdrop, its waves a constant rhythm, and in its presence, Edith found herself smiling a quiet joy she'd thought was gone forever. As the months turned to years, the star of the Atlantic became a distant memory, its golden decks replaced by the simple pleasures of a life rebuilt. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Edith stood on the shore, Ken at her side. She closed her eyes, the sound of the waves washing over her, and felt a peace she hadn't known since Walter's laughter filled their home. The journey had been long, the pain unbearable, but here at the edge of the sea, she'd found her son, her truth, and a happiness she'd never dared to hope for again. Hey, folks! Thanks so much for sticking around and diving into this incredible journey with me. I just want to take a minute to talk about what this story means, and why I felt so compelled to share it. Now let's be clear. This is a fictional tale crafted to pull at your heartstrings and keep you on the edge of your seat. But it's also so much more than that. At its core, this story is about resilience, about the strength it takes to keep searching, even when the world tells you to give up. Edith's fight to find her son, her refusal to accept the lies that tried to tear her family apart, speaks to the kind of love that doesn't give up no matter how long it takes. And Ken's journey. Man, it shows us how the truth has a way of coming to the surface, even when it's been buried by years of deception. What hit me the hardest was the reminder that sometimes the people we trust the most can be the ones who hurt us the deepest. It's a cautionary tale, sure, but it's also a testament to the power of hope, of justice, and of never letting go of the people who matter most. I hope this story sparked something in you, maybe a memory, a feeling, or even just a reminder that the human spirit is stronger than we think. Let's talk about it. Drop a comment below and tell me what moved you most about Edith's journey. And hey, if you've ever had to fight for someone you love or for yourself, I'd love to hear your story too. Thanks for being here with me, friend. Until next time, stay strong, stay curious, and keep fighting the good fight.